Well, Jennifer Westacott, thank you so much for joining us today for our viewers of this conversation. Jennifer, of course, is the head of the Business Council of Australia and clearly has a lot to say on this important topic of how we get this country going and business energised post-coronavirus and this terrible hit that businesses large and small have taken right across Australia. So, Jennifer, thank you for joining me. Let's get into it. What are your, I suppose, top 3 or 4 things that you'd like to see happen?
Well, first of all, we've got to get the economy going again in a way that preserves people's health. I just don't think you can make the trade-off. And there's 2 reasons. One is obviously, I guess I have this fundamental belief in the dignity of every life. But secondly, we run the risk that if we then get another breakout, then we actually have a longer, more severe lockdown, and that's going to have even a bigger economic consequence. So I think we've got to find a way of doing that. And our kind of idea was industry could play a much bigger role in standards and reinforcing those standards, many of which they've done, and they've done it magnificently. Standards of separation, you go into the supermarket, you've got, your marks on the floor, the way people have organised their teams in office buildings. So there's a lot more we could do there. We've obviously got to get to mass testing. And, again, industry is willing to step up there to sort of facilitate high level of testing in the community. And then finally, the app, which we are a very strong supporter of, because the app is crucial to keep us safe and get us back to work. And it's great to see, as we speak today, 2.8 million people registering for it. And I'm a big supporter of it because I think it's fundamental that we're able to track people and trace people. And that if I'm in a workplace and I get a phone call from the health authority in the state that says, hey, you've come into contact with someone who's tested positive, then I can take the right precautions. So I can see whether I've got it. I can isolate if I have, or I can go back to work knowing that I haven't been affected. So that is all going to help us get back to a normal life and get back to work. The second thing we need to do is accelerate coming out of it. And that's about regulation, which we can come back to and have a longer conversation about today. That's about making sure we don't put a single obstacle in the way of a company, small or large, getting back on track. And then the third thing we have to do is to come out of this with a more competitive, faster growing economy. And people often forget it was the reforms that were done in the 80s and 90s that were done by the Hawke and Keating government. But remember, the Liberal Party did not oppose them. They didn't just take an oppositional kind of view for the sake of it. They saw the bigger picture. They saw the long term. Those changes, whether it was the enterprise agreement system, whether it was privatisation of big government assets, whether it was opening up markets, all of those things meant we had nearly 30 years without a recession as we came out of the 90s recession. We've got to make sure we make, as a society, those same sets of decisions so that we come out of this with another 10, 20, 30 years of growth that's very strong, that tackles unemployment and increases people's wages.
Well, Jennifer, I think those 3 thoughts are critically important, the way you put it. It's terrific. And I think perhaps where we ought to start then to get into a bit more detail is let's start with that third area about, I suppose, a national vision, if you like, and an approach to actually say this is setting a framework of reform and that will take us forward 20 or 30 years. And I just make the remark that as a child, I was the son of a member of the Fraser government who was responsible for national development, my late father. And back in those days, the country did have a vision for how to build and improve the lot of people in the economy. And I'd like to see us get back to that. So with that in mind and what you've just said, what are some of the things that have to be done, the big strategic issues in terms of that framework, a la sort of that Hawke-Keating period?
It's a really important question, this, and I think it begins with, rather than a list of stuff, and we obviously have our view about the list of things that needs to be done. We can come back to that. But I do think it starts with what kind of society do we actually want to be? And I think in your father's time and in your mother's time, there's a very strong sense of the kind of Australia we wanted to be. And, if I put some words around that, I do fundamentally believe that people believe in aspiration. They want the best for their families. They want to work hard and they want to be rewarded for that. And I think, that's something we should say, is everything we're going to do kind of aspirational society. We need to be an open trading society, an open society. We cannot afford to be a society that shuts its borders permanently from this. We just will wither on the vine. We have to be a fair society. Now, there are lots of different definitions of fair, but I think most people know broadly what fairness looks like. I think we have to be a society that brings out the best in ourselves and us as a nation. So, we often have this conversation about what are we good at? Well, this is absolutely the time to nail that idea of what do we want to be famous for in Australia. We're famous for mining. We should keep doing that. We're famous for high value added agri products. We should continue to do that. We could do more of that, by the way. What do we want to be famous for? How do we unleash the kind of capabilities that are going to allow us to compete in Asia? How do we want to attract some things back to Australia? And I'm not talking about low cost manufacturing here. I'm talking about high value added niche manufacturing at premium prices. So I think the first debate we could have, Campbell, is what kind of society do we want to be? And that, I think, is a better place to start with your to-do list. And of course, the first underpinning of that is we want people to work. Now, we will have a lot of unemployed people, underemployed people at the end of this. And so in the short term, everything we look at has to be, is that going to get someone back to work? Is that going to give them a job? Is that going to create a new job? Is that going to mean that people get a secure job? Does that mean they're going to get a capacity to be paid more? So that's the big picture. And then if I go through the list, I would start with skills, and we can have a longer discussion today about the skills. But I feel, as you know, I've talked about it many times, just so passionate about this. In the short term, I reckon we're going to have to do a bit of work with kids who've fallen behind during the lockdown. I mean, disadvantaged kids.
Yeah.
They haven't got people like me at home who can say, let me look at your homework and see if that's right. They've got nobody who can do it. I think we're going to have to kind of double down on that a little bit and make sure that those kids who haven't been able to do that homeschooling well, that they're not left behind. Because being left behind, people say, oh, it's 3 months. For some kids, they were just, they were just hanging in there.
Yeah.
3 months means that when they get to year 10, they drop out. And they drop out and they're unemployed. And we've got to make sure that doesn't happen. The second thing we've got to do is, I reckon, make sure that kids get better information when they're in year 10, 11 and 12 about the sort of things they want to do. Too many kids go to uni, they go, it doesn't work out, it was the wrong thing to do, the parents encourage them to do it, it seems the ultimate kind of be all and end all. For some kids, it would have been better to go to TAFE and do a more applied thing. But I think the really crucial thing we've got to break through on is it just takes too long to get qualified in this country. And we're not blending work and learning at the same time. When I was in Germany last year and I was at a really big factory, they had people who'd been working for years, but they were still doing their uni degree or their vet degree at the same time as they were working. So they had work, they had vet, they did some subjects at uni. This was a very big company, a car company. It was like a kind of internship, or I don't know, it doesn't matter what you call it, but people, the technical term is micro-credential, whatever people want to call it. It's a module, and I get a series of them, and I get some kind of account that sort of an employer looks at and says, hey, hang on, Jennifer's done this, and this. Hey, that makes her able to do A, B, C, D, and E. I can give her a job. So those things we've got to do. That the last one we got to do really fast. The idea that people over 55 particularly who've got low skills are going to be unemployed for long periods of time, which is what did happen in the last recession. We can't let that happen again. So we've got to make sure that that group of people can get trained up really fast. And it will be in those technology areas, because I think one of the things that will come out of this is that people will automate more quickly.
Look, I think there's going to be profound changes to the way that the workplace looks as a result of this. I mean, just the fact that we're having this meeting by Zoom, and I was reflecting with my business partners in recent conversations about, would we really jump on a plane as much as we used to? I'd say I'm sorry to the airlines, to Qantas particularly. I'm sorry you won't be seeing as much of me as in the past, I would say. But I think there will be a lot of changes there. Do you really think, though, that we technologically are up to speed? I have a feeling we're not. I think we teach people how to use something like this in school, but we don't teach them how to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting. I can't remember the study I saw a while ago, but that most people don't use most of the facilities that really are available to them, be it on their iPhone or be it on their laptop or whatever. And I'm not sure that many, particularly small businesses, have all of those digital processes. So invoicing is the obvious one. I mean, we're very committed that small business be paid on time. But if you're still doing manual processing and things like that, and you're not doing single touch payroll and you're not using sort of digital invoicing, and this is something where governments, I think, could really kind of maybe look at some tax incentives for small business to really accelerate their digital capability. I mean, the big companies will do it themselves. So I think you're right. We're not sort of really ready for this. If I think of other areas, I mean, I kind of talked a lot about skills because I feel so passionately about it. The next I think we've got to think about is regulation and red tape, or whatever people want to call it. Red tape obviously is the buzzword. But what's really fascinated about me about this terrible crisis is how much stuff has just been stopped and paused. And, whether it's the conduct of a regulator, whether it's a particular rule, and you say, well, guys, why would we bring that back after this? So things like, crazy trading hours. So people not being able to sell stuff before, 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock in a particular state. People not being able to open shops before 11 o'clock on a Sunday in Adelaide. People having curfews on deliveries to shops. When Coles and Woolworths, had to kind of restock those shelves so quickly. And some of these things have been suspended, and you think to yourself, well, why would you now reinstate this plethora of rules and regulations for which it was obvious why they were suspended, because they're getting in the way of people being able to get on with stuff.
Just on the red tape and regulation, I'd like to bounce some things back to you. I mean,
Sure.
I run with some partners a commercial property funds management business, and we have to deal with a variety of government agencies who they shall remain nameless. And it is not as easy and as straightforward as I think our politicians would think to technologically deal with them. So, for example, one agency that we have a reporting requirement to and have to be registered with, we were trying to deal with them recently. It took 3 weeks, and across the 3 weeks, about 3 hours of cumulative time just to fulfil our obligation to register because their systems weren't up to it. Another example I'd give you is, quite rightfully, when you're opening, when someone seeks to open a bank account, the bank has to conduct ID checks, etc., to prevent any money laundering and the funding of terrorism. But if banks necessarily are going to have to downsize branches and not have them there, you've got this juxtaposition between, on the one hand, source documents have to be provided, but there's nowhere to take them, or there's fewer places to take them. Do you see where I'm going? And I think government, so the people who are administering that part of the law and the banks have got to come together to work out how, in this century, the 21st century, these things are done efficiently electronically. That's an area I think is critically important.
Absolutely. For example, one thing that has actually been quite interesting has been electronic signatures on documents. And that's something that we've got to think about. AGMs, well, why can't they be digital from now on? But the whole question of licenses and multiple approvals and, the repeat questions, this is what companies tell me all the time. They will get the same question from 5 agencies, and they say, but we've already given that information to this agency. Oh, well, we want it like this in a different form. That is all. Somebody has to do that, and that's their productivity is compromised by the fact that they're having to do that. So what I'd like us to do is just almost kind of have a bit of a vision about a common sense society. Why are we doing that? I mean, of course you need laws. They're there to protect people. They're there to protect the environment. All of that's absolutely fine. But I think sometimes we confuse complex processes with good outcomes. And we think, if we have lots and lots and lots of agencies and lots of people involved in that decision, somehow by virtue of more people, it will be a better decision. I think that's absolutely, completely the wrong thing. We need more accountability, more transparency, more clarity. and a greater sense on what's the problem we want to protect for, and what's the process that gets us that better outcome, rather than everyone piling on like they do. When I talk to small businesses about licensing, about, you know, having to have 5 or 6 awards in just what are often kind of like little businesses, that sort of stuff, I think we've got to sort of take a big, deep breath at the end of this, or actually probably as we're coming out of this, and saying, hang on, let's just pause for a minute about what is the problem we think we're protecting for here. Sometimes it's legitimate. And is this very complex process actually the best way of protecting for it? Or is it just, have we just got so used to that?
Absolutely. And I think this might sound minute detail and even a bit trite, but you mentioned accountability. I'd like to see accountability from political leaders and senior bureaucrats who are administering these laws and these systems. I mean, a little fun test would be, I'd love to challenge state treasurers to navigate their respective Office of State Revenue websites and requirements for collecting land tax. I'd love to see Josh Frydenberg and the Prime Minister actually have to sit down, register a business through say ASIC, apply for the ABN, do all the things, set up their accounting system on say something like a proprietary system like Xero, to register, ensure that STP, which you referred to before, is set up, because there's an awful lot of things that people have to do that don't work well. And I think if they could see firsthand, the heads of these agencies and the politicians themselves, I think very quickly, if they had to do it, they would be seeing that there's a huge opportunity for improvement.
And I think the problem with that, I agree with you. I think the issue for a particularly small business, but don't underestimate how much red tape and regulation overwhelms big companies. But the problem is, while people are doing that, they're not, if I go to the small business example, if you're spending your whole weekend filling in all those forms, you're not spending your weekend, A, with your family, and B, you haven't got enough time to think about, well, how do I grow my business? And after this, as we come out of this, we are going to need those businesses more than ever to think about, well, how do I get back on my feet? How do I think about investing? What can I invest in? How do I expand? How do I become more productive? How do I put more people on? How do I grow? If they're kind of just overwhelmed with, oh my God, I've got to today do this form and this form and this form and this form and this form, they won't have that headspace or just physical time to think about what is going to confront a lot of businesses, which is the world has changed so much. Their old business model is not going to work. And I think this is something we've got to really help, particularly small business, think through. They're going to have to be quite different, some of them, and they won't necessarily have some of the digital skills. They won't have some of the digital systems. And we are going to have, like, I think, a national effort to help small business, not just come back, but come back stronger and modernise what they're doing.
Yeah. So let's go to an issue you alluded to before, which was tax. The federal government's blown the budget to smithereens for court necessity. We've not been critical of that. They've done what's required. How does this get paid for? What's the approach, the tax system going forward? Are there taxes that should go? Are there taxes that should be raised? I'm happy to put it on the line myself. I feel that we should have a final effort at getting rid of inefficient state taxes. And something I've always been against, but I'm prepared to put on the line now, is put the GST up, say, to 15%, as long as those inefficient state taxes go. What's the BCA saying on this issue?
Well, it's a really important point, this. And I think the first starting point is anyone who thinks that the way out of this is higher taxes is making the wrong call from the beginning. Our way out of this is not higher taxes, because if we have higher overall taxes and we actually stifle growth, we stifle the capacity for companies to hire more people, to put someone back in a job, we destroy incentives. That is the low road to a low growth country, and a very, very, very slow way out of this. So the best way to pay off the bills that we've worked up in this, quite rightly, in my view, and I think the government has been magnificent in things like the JobKeeper. We are going to have to try and find a way that we grow the economy faster. So that's the first point. The kind of higher taxing mob will be out arguing for, here's, our new list of higher taxes. Time and time again, that has proven to be unpopular with people, but also not the right thing to do. So the second thing then is to say, well, what kind of tax system do we want? Well, we want stuff that rewards incentives. We particularly want something that drives business investment, which is, business investment was as low as it was in 1994 as a share of GDP before we got into this terrible mess.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and why does business investment matter? Well, it matters because if I put on new machinery, if I make my plant upgrade, if I make things more efficient, if I expand my markets, if I get new vehicles, if I do more, if I have a new factory, if I open a new mine, I am going to employ more people. I'm going to pay them more if we can get productivity up. That's the kind of problem to solve. Now, we have been, as you know, long advocates that the company tax rate is too high in Australia. We're not asking for the lowest rate, we're asking for a competitive rate. It's one of the highest in the world, and you've got to ask yourself, with one of the highest company tax rates in the world, is that going to be the way that we get jobs going and we get people back to work? And if we're not going to do something like company tax, then we've got to look at something like a big investment allowance, because the problem to solve is to get investment happening and to reaffirm the point I just made. Why? Because it will get people back to work. On the state taxes, look, couldn't agree more. I mean, again, it's really interesting. What if people suspended payroll tax? We've got to get rid of some of these taxes that, are just harmful. Stamp duty, I think you and I have talked about this before. Stamp duty is like a productivity sapping tax. And a lot of companies are going to have to restructure, which means they're going to have to relocate, they're going to have to get new buildings, they're going to have to do different things. Suddenly they're looking at their maths and they're going, oh, hang on, now I've got a big stamp duty bill to pay. Oh, I won't do that. People who want to move houses, oh, I'd like to move, I'm living in a house that's 3 or 4 bedroom, that could probably, get a family. Oh, and they look at the stamp duty, oh, I'm not going to do that. So these big productivity sapping taxes have to go. Look, I'm in your camp. I think it would have been good to keep the GST in the mix of discussion. The problem with tax reform, as you know better than me, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, is that the whole thing becomes a conversation about the GST, and then it becomes this poisonous, toxic kind of debate, as opposed to saying, what's the overall objective, which is across the whole tax system, we lower the rates and we broaden the base and we solve our revenue problems in that way, but we also don't destroy incentive and we don't destroy investment incentives particularly. And of course, we don't destroy incentives for people who want money back in their pocket because they worked really hard. Again, it'd be great to start with some principles before we start the kind of usual sport in Australia, ruling things in and ruling things out. And we've got to solve some of those Commonwealth state issues that you, when you were Premier, I think defined really well. So again, I think the challenge is going to be how much can we take on in tax before, we just get overwhelmed with the complexity of it. But to your point, I mean, let's start with the really bad taxes, and don't take my word for it. Chris Richardson, one of the world's leading economists, he says, what are the 2 worst taxes at the state level? Stamp duty. At the Commonwealth level, company tax.
I hope there's a few people willing to play it with a straight bat this time on that issue. There's probably 3 things we should talk about before we finish, if you've got a mind to. One would be the whole issue of electricity and energy costs and the vexed problem of carbon pricing and the like. Another one would be the industrial relations system, Fair Work Australia and the complexities there. And another one you might care to comment on is the Federal Environmental Law, the EPBCA. So would you like to have a go at, the first of those?
Let's go to the energy stuff. Look, we've got 3 things we've got to try and solve for here. Irrespective of the debate about climate change and the science of it, which certainly we accept in the BCA. We've got to, the bulk of Australians want something done about this, but they want it done in a way that there's a very clear sense of where we're heading, and we've got to do it in a way that creates more affordable energy and in a way that creates reliable energy systems. And we've got to get those three things right. We've got to, in our view, meet that goal of net zero by 2050. And we think that's the right endpoint. I think many Australians kind of want to know, where are we going with all of this? And then how do we do that in a way that gets people's bills down and keeps reliability up? And I think companies want certainty. And look, we've had a debate for a decade, in my view, a very toxic debate about this issue for a long time. And as a result, we've made almost no progress. And we've gone backwards. We used to be an energy comparative advantage superpower. Now we're not. Talk to any manufacturer and they say, what's your biggest issue? My energy bill. So this time, let's try and get the three things lined up. We feel very strongly that that net zero target is doable, and that if we don't do it, the technology and the investment that will flow from that will go to other countries and it won't come here. And then we'll be paying a much bigger adjustment and catch up. And the second thing is obviously affordability and reliability. I think, look, there's going to be lots of debates about the carbon price. Governments haven't been wanting to do it. It's a very divisive issue. But I think we shouldn't underestimate how much policy architecture, to use that jargon, we've actually got to work with. We've got one of the best greenhouse gas reporting systems in the world. We've got an emissions reduction fund. We've got agencies that can sort of go into the market and accelerate things. We've got this abundance of resources that we've got at our fingertips, like gas, that is an incredibly efficient transition fuel. I think the challenge is, how do we bring it all together to meet those three objectives, and how do we end some of the sort of, I think, really just debates that have just stalled every piece of action. The one area where I do think we need a market, though, there's a little bit of complexity, but a net zero target does not mean we will be producing no CO2. It just means that overall we are neutral. And that means we need some kind of storage and sequestration, to use the technical jargon. And I reckon one of the sectors that's best placed to do that is the land management, is farms. But they're not going to do it just because we ask them to do it. We have to create some kind of market. So the best thing to do there would be to say to people who emit over their baseline, and we've got that safeguard mechanism, the baseline scheme that the government has set, you have to pay into an offset arrangement, and that will be used to basically sequester carbon. So that would be one thing. We need some kind of offset.
Well, I spoke to John Anderson the other day, of course, a former Deputy Prime Minister, but a farmer himself. And this actually came up, the opportunity for farmers, for agriculture to play this huge role in getting to a target like the one that you've mentioned.
And they can also play a huge role in terms of wind power, solar. I was in Toowoomba last year, the huge GE AGL wind farm. And of course that, during the kind of worst of the drought, that was providing income to many farmers who couldn't get an income from their normal operations because of the drought. So the issue with the energy stuff is that it is complicated. There is no kind of silver kind of bullet on this one, but it would be good if we started with, where do we want to get to? Why do we want to get to that? Because we want to get to the 2050 because the science says that's going to stop dangerous climate change. How do we get there? Well, we've taken in 10-year chunks, depending on technology, depending on the capacity of the economy. And we keep that, those other two things have got to work in. Got to keep affordability, got to keep reliability. I mean, it is complicated, but it would be great if we could just, this time, park the, the old kind of...
Well, let me say this. I'm unsure about the 2050, the target you've espoused. I am somewhat of a climate skeptic, but having said that, you know what, Jennifer, I am so over the impasse. We've got the four-wheel drive bogged in the swamp. That's the issue. We've got to get it out there. We've got to have a compact. We've got to have a deal. We've got to move on and let the electricity sector in particular make the investments they need to do, and do it with confidence. And ultimately that will see downward pressure on prices.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think we just got to all try and get somewhere where we've got the investment particularly happening, and particularly happening in those regional communities. And I'll come back to regional development in a minute. So that's energy and climate. Nothing is simple there, but it would be great if everyone just called a truce on the old battles and said, let's just have a ceasefire, a kind of environmental détente, and we just said, everyone, pause, let's try and work out where we want to head with this and see if we can get there. And the unions have been terrific, I think, in this crisis. And, you know, they've worked very hard to try and make sure that those changes that needed to happen to the EBAs could happen quickly. I think where we need to start again is again with some principles. I'm a big supporter of the enterprise agreement system. Why? Because it is basically common sense. Employees and employers sit down together, they work out where the enterprise needs to be, what needs to happen, be it, you know, new machinery, new rosters, whatever, new training, and they work out how they're going to get there. And the benefit of the enterprise agreement system was, and should always be, that each party shares in the gains of that. The company is able to expand and grow, and the workers get paid more because productivity is high. Now, you know, again, if we could all get on the page that the enterprise agreement system is worth fighting for, and what we see is this at the moment, it's falling around behind us. There's 20% less active EBAs. And that means companies aren't using it. Why? Because it's too hard to get an EBA approved. It's too complex. There are too many things in them. It takes too long to vary them. So if we could get all on the same page that we want to preserve that system, make it simpler, make it tidier, make it go back to that principle that we all want to share in those gains, that would be a really good starting point. On awards, they're too complicated. There's 122 of them. Let's try and see if we can get some simplification there. And 122 means they've all got multiple clauses. I think the complexity is the first thing to solve on top of that principle about where we want to go. And let's try and do it in a non-combative way. I mean, I think, you know, I would sort of make the point that, to be fair to the ACTU, this is not the time for people to try things on. You know, like, this is the time to kind of respect the fact that the government has worked very effectively with the union movement. They've given that flexibility, but that is a trust equation for both sides. And it would be good that we can keep that trust going beyond that and start to deal with IR.
Oh, look, I'd hope so. And I mean, you know, you talked about the sort of country that we should be going forward. And I mean, that fairness thing, I like, you know, that's axiomatic in my view. And I mean, the Howard government suffered in 2007 because it was seen that they'd gone a step or two too far. So, you know, I would hope that perhaps the union movement would at least look at this whole argument about the complexity, because, you know, if the ABC has trouble paying people the right amount of money, and well, you know, they have no axe to grind, surely that's very, very telling. And I don't for a moment believe that it's some rather large Australian corporates suffering reputational risk would deliberately set out to underpay their workers either. So the wage theft thing, I'm afraid, I particularly roll my eyes when I see members of the Federal Coalition uttering those words. I think it's actually it's a signal that we actually do need to sort out what is a very complicated system.
Absolutely. You think about the complexity of some of the companies you've just talked about. You know, you think about the complexity of 122 awards, people who are on permanent casual, people who work different hours every week, people who have, you know, supplements to their wages. You think about the complexity of managing those workforces of 100,000 plus people. Nobody has set out to deliberately steal from their workers. And that is very different to wage theft, which is that people purposefully organise the way their conditions and work arrangements to rip their workers off. That is not what has happened in those cases. And in many cases, people have been overpaid as well, and that never seems to get any attention in the media, unfortunately. But it does tell you something about the complexity of the system. And I think, and if I go to your Environmental Act, the EPBC Act, again, we always confuse in Australia, and it goes to my earlier point about regulation, we confuse complexity with a good outcome.
Yeah.
So and I reckon this is what's wrong with that act. It's too complicated. What would be better is that we're very clear upfront about two things. The strategic assessment of the environmental values of a particular area, and what can or cannot be done. And everyone has to live with that, including developers.
Yeah,
everyone has to abide by that. So that would be one place to start. And we should be assessing those areas across Australia that have very high environmental values. And we should be saying, look, in this area, you can do this, 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 and this, but you can't do this because we've assessed that as too high a risk. Then people kind of know what the rules are. The second thing is that we should be very clear for these major developments. These are the standards that you must meet. And if you do not meet them, you cannot get approval. And the third thing that we should try and tidy up is that if you're going to appeal against something, you have to appeal on material grounds, and you have to appeal that the development is not consistent with the rules. The system can't be a protest movement, and it can't be gamed by people who don't like the decision when the decision was made with the kind of right processes. So if we could get simplicity and single points of accountability, and less people all doing the same thing. The number of companies who say to me, as I said earlier, the number of times we are asked to provide the same information to different agencies in government, or just a little kind of change to the same intent of the information, which means that everyone has to then go and get that study done again. And you say, well, to what end? To what purpose? I mean, I'm always amazed at some of the kind of standards issues, and you sort of think, well, have we got the right outcome? Have we got beautifully designed buildings all over our cities and our suburbs? No. And yet the rule book is probably a metre high. And for all of that, we still have some developments that you sort of drive past and you sort of say, well, that could have been a bit better. But so I think that's the key with the environmental stuff, is that we just ask ourselves, outcomes, strategic assessment, good process, not all this double handling, which I think is not in anyone's interest because it blurs accountability lines. I wanted to talk about regions before we finish, because I'm passionate about this. We've been doing this thing, Strong Australia, getting out, talking to people for 2 or 3 years now, and it really strikes me that, and you know this better than anyone, because you've been in those communities.
Well, and Queensland's probably the most regionally diversified state, with vibrant regional cities up our coastline and inland as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And I just think we've got to make sure that as we come out of recovery, we think about those regions and the places where we could, if we just invested a bit more, then those places could actually really get cracking. And in them getting cracking, we'll get the country moving again. You know Townsville much better than I do. But, they could do so much on that defence training and the fact that they've got that big defence facility there. In somewhere like Cairns, the whole capacity to bring more produce down from the Atherton Tablelands by maybe a second bypass or a second pass over the Atherton Tablelands, getting that produce into Cairns Airport, the whole infrastructure around regional development. I think now's our time to think about, I don't know, is it 15, is it 10 places across Australia where they've got the greatest capacity to lift the overall production of the country, and we should really double down and invest hard in them, because it will be great for those regions. And we are going to have to think about alternatives for quite a long time than tourism in places like Cairns. How do we help those economies be stronger? How do we help them play to their strengths? How do we get their exports up? Because if we do that, we'll actually make the country stronger. If I think about Geelong, real advantage in advanced manufacturing. let's really invest in it. Think about Western Sydney, huge opportunity for advanced manufacturing in Western Sydney with a 24/7 airport that will be very substantial. Huge opportunity to open up, Western Sydney for not just Australia, but for Southeast Asia and the world as a centre for advanced manufacturing. So I think the regional conversation, I'd be very anxious if we just go back to our old sort of habits of this national conversation being about Sydney and Melbourne and the inner suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, instead of a conversation about how do we play to our strengths across the board and how do we play to our strengths in regional Australia, because I think it's a source of big frustration for people.
Well, look, I think there are spin-off benefits. I accept absolutely what you've said about the economic imperative, but some of the spin-off benefits are great too. I mean, there are regional centres around this country which could grow, places like Bathurst or Orange or Maryborough in Queensland, which has languished economically for many years, and you could put more people into many of these regional centres without consequential huge investments in infrastructure. For example, some of these centres have capacity in terms of their water supply and wastewater systems. They have pretty good road networks and connectivity already. They might have a good airport, albeit it needs an upgrade. So I think there are great advantages there, and you might not have to pump as much money into infrastructure as you would in sort of Greater Sydney or even Brisbane. Another thing, prior to this crisis, we were again hearing a lot about affordability, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Well, there's great lifestyle opportunities in these places and very affordable residential property. So I think, and land to be able to afford that growth opportunity. So I think there's a heck of a lot in it.
Well, it's interesting. Every time I go to a regional location, I say, what are the things that would make a bit more of a difference? And people have their infrastructure projects and they have their sort of ideas. But the common thread is your point, it's population. We could have more people living here. We could give them a better lifestyle. That would create more demand. I think people forget that people are demand creators, particularly in service economies. And of course, when I was in Townsville just recently, before all this kind of really stopped travel, they just had the Elton John concert at the new stadium. 20,000 people turned up. All those shopkeepers who were able to open and get their food trucks going, and they had the best weekend they've ever had, and like that, the place was buzzing. I suspect it's not buzzing at the moment, but we would really benefit from being able to keep our migration numbers up, which is going to be essential, by the way, for the economy to keep going. But think more about the role that our regions can play. But I think a permanent reduction in our migration, which has propped up our economy for a long period of time, would not be a good outcome.
Well, look, I suppose a final thought on that, and I totally agree with you, but if we could, again, there was this debate going on for a while, and I think it went up a few blind alleyways, but what about, that we maintain those migration levels, but then we have a sensible and pragmatic sort of planning approach where we're saying, okay, what mayors out there across regional Australia prepare to take more? Okay, well, you say you're prepared to take another 3,000 people in your community. Well, okay, you're saying you want to do it, the community want to do it. Okay, well, let's shape an infrastructure package of support around taking that regional centre forward. That's probably the way to do it.
I reckon that's absolutely right. And you look at what Premier Berejiklian has done in Western Sydney. She's done a magnificent job because she said, look, here's the infrastructure. So around the airport, $20 billion of infrastructure being built. And then, all prioritised so that then, we can kind of attract industries in there. We can obviously get the airport supported. You're exactly right. We need to say, look, who's willing to sort of step up? It's interesting, when I gave a speech at the Press Club last year about this regional development issue, the number of mayors who kind of wrote to me and said, pick us. No, I don't have the power to pick anything. But
I'm not surprised, actually. The journalists might have been surprised, but I am not surprised by that reaction.
So we should say, okay, what's the deal here? What's the bargain that we do here? You do this, in return, you get these infrastructure packages. But I can't think of a single place I've been in the last 2-3 years where people have said, we don't want anyone here. They want people because they know that stronger population means stronger economy, and we've got to make sure they've got the infrastructure to do it.
Well, Jennifer Westacott, that has been a great conversation about the policy position of the Business Council of Australia. So I really thank you for your time today and your contribution to this series.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.